The snow around the frozen Belgian field was still stained black when American patrols found the bodies. 11 men of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, black soldiers taken prisoner during the Battle of the Bulge, were discovered face down in the frost, stripped of their helmets, hands bound, shot at close range. Their uniforms were torn, their faces beaten, their final footprints pressed into the snow where they had been forced to kneel. For days, villagers had whispered of screams in the night, of SS trucks moving through the darkness, of men begging for their lives before gunfire rolled across the fields. The war was already brutal, but what the SS did here crossed into pure murder. The winter of 1944 fell like a hammer across the Ardennes, freezing rivers solid and turning every village road into a sheet of ice. American trucks groaned under the weight of men, ammunition, and fear, inching forward through snow that swallowed boots to the ankle. Among them rolled the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, black American soldiers who hauled the heavy 150mm howitzers that cracked German armor like eggshells. They were veterans now, scarred by months of bombardments and sleepless nights, their guns having spoken for them in places they were never allowed to speak for themselves. In the Jim Crow Army, they fought harder for respect than they did for survival. And still, every man among them knew the Germans feared the thunder of their artillery. On the morning of December 16th, the thunder turned back on them. It began with rumors carried by terrified Belgian villagers. German armor had breached the front line. SS Panzer units were pouring through forest roads once thought impassable. American infantry fell back in chaos, and snow-covered fields that had been quiet hours earlier now echoed with the grinding tread of Tiger tanks. The German counteroffensive, Hitler's last gamble, had begun. The Battle of the Bulge was exploding across the Ardennes like a storm of steel. The men of the 333rd received the order every artillery battalion dreaded: hold position. Their howitzers were too large to retreat quickly, too heavy to tow out over ice-slick roads choked with fleeing units. They would stay, fire until the barrels burned, then fall back when ordered. They dug in east of St. Vith, their gun pits carved into frozen earth. Snow dusted their uniforms. Frost turned breath to crystals. Private George Moten, just 19, loaded shells with numb fingers, whispering to himself that he would ride this winter home. When the German artillery began, it was not a barrage. It was an earthquake. Trees splintered. Snow geysered into the sky. Men threw themselves into trenches, covering their heads. The ground trembled under the weight of advancing armor. Radios crackled with fragmented orders. The 333rd fired blindly into the white haze, the recoil of each shot pushing the guns backward into ice and mud. Hours passed as smoke and snow swirled into one gray nightmare. By nightfall, the order came: withdraw. But it was too late. Roads behind them had collapsed into chaos. Civilian wagons, American jeeps, wounded men stumbling on foot. Everything that could flee was already fleeing. The 333rd split. Some stayed with the guns, firing until capture or death. Others were sent west on foot, carrying rifles instead of shells. Trudging toward the town of Wereth, a tiny Belgian village whose chimneys glowed faintly against the snow, 11 men walked that road, exhausted, hungry, cold, burrowing into their bones. Civilians saw them and opened doors. One farmhouse took them in. A family terrified but human enough to feed them hot bread soup to let them warm their hands near the stove. The soldiers thanked them, removing helmets, rubbing frost from their faces. For a moment, war felt far away. They believed they had escaped, but someone saw, someone told. A local collaborator whispered to the SS that black American soldiers were hiding in the village. Within minutes, engines growled at the edge of Wereth. SS troops of Kampfgruppe Piper, furious from hours of fighting, poured into the snow-packed road. The family barely had time to shut their doors before German boots stomped through the village, rifles leveled at every window. The Americans knew what capture meant. The SS had executed prisoners before. Piper's men had murdered Americans at Malmedy just hours earlier. But still, the 11 men of the 333rd walked out with hands raised. They weren't cowards. They weren't begging. They surrendered as soldiers, not animals. They believed they would be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. They were wrong. Villagers watched from shuttered windows as the SS marched the men out of Wereth, down a frozen lane lined with pine trees and stone fences. Snow muffled their footsteps. A German truck followed behind, its engine humming like a predator's breath. The soldiers walked slowly, shoulders slumped from exhaustion but still alive. Still hoping. No one in Wereth saw them again. Night swallowed the lane. The SS vanished into the trees with their prisoners. Gunshots echoed, distant hollow cracks. Some villagers crossed themselves. Others wept quietly. The war had taught them silence. Back at the front, the rest of the 333rd fought for their lives. The Germans pressed harder, tanks rolling like iron beasts through snow. Artillerymen fired until their barrels glowed red, until ammunition ran dry and positions were overrun. Survivors retreated west, guns abandoned in frozen mud. The battalion fractured. Some escaped to join the 969th Field Artillery. Some were captured and marched away. Some died where they stood, shells still in hand. When American reinforcements later retook Wereth, they searched for the missing 11. Locals pointed to a field outside town, a patch of land where snow lay strangely uneven. Soldiers approached slowly, rifles raised as if expecting the earth itself to attack. What they found froze the patrol to silence. The bodies lay face down, partially buried by snow and shattered ice. Some had broken legs, some had smashed fingers, some had bullet wounds in their heads. One had been beaten so badly his skull was split. Their gloves were gone, their boots torn, their hands bound behind their backs with wire. The SS had tortured them, executed them, left them to freeze. In the open field like animals, American soldiers knelt there in the snow, not because they were ordered to, but because grief hit them like artillery. These men hadn't died in combat. They had been murdered for the color of their skin, for wearing an American uniform while being black. And in death they were left nameless, silent beneath the Belgian frost. Word spread quietly at first, whispers in the ranks, then letters home, then a brief line in army reports. The army buried their bodies, but the world moved on. The massacre was overshadowed by Malmedy, by Bastogne, by the push into Germany. The 11 were folded into history's margins, their names written but rarely spoken. Private George Moten's staff, Sergeant Thomas Fort. Technician Corporal James Leatherwood, Private. First Class Major Bradley. Corporal. George Davis, Private. First Class Dew Turner. Private. First Class James Stewart, Private. First Class Robert Green. Private William. Schomburg, Private. First Class Nathaniel. Moss, Private James Brown. They were sons, husbands, brothers, men, who had left Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, places where they were second-class citizens, to fight a war for a country that had not yet fought for them. Yet they fought anyway. The snowfall began again, gentle flakes covering the bodies as if the sky itself tried to hide what had been done. The American patrol took off their helmets and bowed their heads. Some prayed, some cursed, but every man felt the same thing. The war had crossed a line that could never be repaired. These soldiers would not be forgotten, not by the men who found them, not by the people of Wereth, and not by history, however long it took to write their chapter. For in that frozen field, in the silence after torture, the story of the Wereth 11 had only begun. The night that swallowed the 11 also swallowed the village that tried to save them. Wereth was small, just a cluster of stone farmhouses, a chapel, and fields that rolled out to the tree line. Belgian families lived quietly, keeping animals, tending frozen orchards, praying the war would pass without taking their homes. But on December 17, 1944, the village heard the rumble of engines long before the headlights glowed through the snow. Kampfgruppe Piper, SS Panzer troops hardened on the Eastern Front, moved like a spear through the Ardennes. They took prisoners when it suited them. They killed them when it didn't. Their orders were simple: break the American line, sow terror, leave no resistance standing. They were efficient, ruthless, exhausted, and angry. They had lost men in the fighting outside St. Vith. They blamed American artillery for the dead. The 333rd had been firing on them all morning. The 11 men who escaped the barrage had no idea which unit hunted them. They only knew that the cold was winning. Their clothes were soaked with melted snow. Their boots were stiff, laces frozen into black knots. Some bled from shrapnel wounds. Their stomachs shrank with hunger. The road blurred beneath them, shapes of barns and trees bending in the wind. When the farmhouse door opened and warmth spilled across the snow, it felt like a miracle. The villagers gave them food, not much but enough to feel life return. They poured hot coffee into tin cups and watched steam rise from trembling hands. The soldiers didn't speak loudly or laugh. They simply ate, silently thanking God for a roof and a fire. But war has a way of turning even safety into a trap. A collaborator, whether for fear, spite, or money, slipped away and alerted the Germans. The SS convoy rolled into Wereth fast, engines throttling hard, metal tracks cracking ice beneath them. Their truck stopped abruptly in the center of the village. Boots hit the ground. Rifle bolts slid forward. A woman screamed and was dragged back inside. Children were shoved behind doors. The air froze in place. The SS demanded the Americans. Nobody answered, so they fired shots into the sky and dragged a man into the street. A neighbor, a farmer. They beat him until someone else cracked and pointed toward the farmhouse. The 11 soldiers knew the sound of boots. They knew German voices. They stood, looked at each other, and stepped outside with their hands up. Not one ran, not one begged. The SS surrounded them, rifles pressed into spines, shouting orders in sharp, cutting German. They forced the men to march, pushing them down the road and away from the village lights. Snow swallowed their footprints as quickly as they were made. The villagers watched from behind curtains. Mothers clutched children. Fathers closed fists and felt their own helplessness. One young boy tried to run after the Americans, but his father grabbed him, burying his face in a coat to muffle his cries. The war had taken too much already. It would not take him too. Down the lane, the SS stopped in a clearing shielded by pine trees. The men shivered, breath forming clouds. The German officers inspected them. Some of the Americans still wore artillery patches. One carried a picture of his wife. Another held a Bible beneath his coat. The SS tore it away and threw it into the snow. Then came the beating. Rifle butts crushed jaws. Boots broke ribs. Hands were tied behind backs with wire so tight it cut through skin. A soldier tried to speak German, tried to say they were prisoners. Not combatants, but was struck until his teeth scattered across the snow. The SS did not speak much. They worked. In the village, the collaborator returned, smiling thinly, telling the Germans where else Americans might hide. The villagers hated him, but they hated their fear more. Retaliation came swiftly in wartime. For every act of kindness, the SS took payment in blood. People learned to survive by staying silent. But that night, silence tasted like shame. The clearing filled with muffled screams. The trees swallowed the sound. Then the shots began. Not fast, not a volley, but slow. One bullet, then another, then another. 11 times. The earth twitched beneath falling bodies. Snow turned dark beneath them. Their faces pressed into the ice. Their breath vanished. The SS left the bodies where they fell. No burial, no prayer, just silence and frost. By morning, the snow returned, drifting over the field, hiding the wounds. The villagers walked the path, heads lowered. Some knelt, some cried, some whispered words they hoped the dead could hear. They wanted to move the bodies, but the SS still patrolled, engines growling in the distance. Anyone caught helping Americans would join them in the ground, so they waited. For days. The war rolled past Wereth like a black tide. Tanks thundered west toward Malmedy. Artillery lit the horizon. The villagers kept their secret, kept their grief, kept their eyes on the field. When the American patrol arrived, the villagers led them without a word. The soldiers did not need to be told what happened. The scene spoke for itself. Bound wrists, broken bones, powder burns behind ears, bruises beneath frost, torn uniforms stripped of patches and dog tags. This was not war, this was murder. A corporal removed his gloves and pressed them into the stiff hands of one of the dead, as if that small warmth might matter. Another soldier knelt and shut the eyes of a man whose face had been frozen in pain. Someone swore softly. Someone else whispered a prayer. They covered the bodies and carried them back to the village on litters of branches and blankets. The villagers gathered at the road, hats removed, listening to the soft crunch of snow beneath slow footsteps. For once the war was quiet. The SS did not return to Wereth. They had moved on to other atrocities. But the memory remained like a scar burned into winter. The 11 were buried. Their names entered into reports. And then, like so many black soldiers of World War II, their story disappeared into silence. History books filled with battles and generals and medals, but not with the names of those left in the snow because of the color of their skin. Years passed. Decades. Wereth rebuilt. Children grew. Roads paved over the old mud. The field where the men died became green again each spring. Travelers drove past without knowing its secret. But the village remembered. Belgium remembered. And someday, the world would as well. The bodies lay under American flags in a small Belgian churchyard, each coffin lowered into frozen earth as soldiers of the 99th Infantry stood in silence. Snow drifted through the air like pale ash. There were no bands, no speeches, no generals in long coats saluting beneath polished medals. Just tired infantrymen, exhausted medics, and villagers who clutched their hats and bowed their heads. Church bells tolled softly, their sound floating across the valley like a morning song. The war moved on without pausing for grief. Within hours, trucks rolled west, engines grumbling, boots stomping, artillery echoing through the hills. The Ardennes still burned. Bastogne was under siege. The 101st Airborne fought for every inch of snow-covered road. The SS turned the forests of Belgium red with blood. There was no time to stop, no time for investigations, no time for justice. The 11 men of the 333rd were entered into casualty lists as KIA, killed in action. No mention of torture, no mention of being bound, no mention of execution. Their deaths were logged like bullets fired, one more statistic in a war drowning in numbers. But among the soldiers who found them, something stayed. The image of those bodies in the field, their hands frozen behind them, faces pressed into ice, the cruelty carved into bone, did not fade. Some wrote letters home telling mothers and wives what had happened, promising that the army would not forget. Others swore that when Berlin finally fell, they would remember the faces of the men who shot bound prisoners in the snow. And yet, as months turned to years, silence spread thicker than winter frost. The United States celebrated victory in 1945. The world rejoiced. Flags waved in the streets. Newspapers printed headlines of liberation and triumph. But the story of Wereth barely earned a footnote. In the glow of victory, America chose what history to remember and what to bury. The Army conducted a brief investigation, too brief. They visited the site, documented the bodies, identified the bullets. They interviewed villagers who whispered in broken English and German about SS troops with skull patches on their collars. But the war was over. Prisoners were scattered, and the officers responsible for the massacre slipped among thousands of men returning to shattered Germany. No single name was charged. No trial was held. The file was closed quietly. The world moved on. Families of the dead received telegrams, short, cold messages that said their sons had died during action against the enemy. No mention of what was seen in that Belgian field. Mothers wept into folded flags. Wives raised children alone. Brothers returned from the Pacific or Italy to find that their kin had left the world without honor. Segregation still ruled America. Black soldiers came home to towns where they could not sit at a lunch counter or vote in an election. Many were told their medals meant nothing here. Some were beaten in uniform. Some were lynched. Home did not feel like victory. It felt like another battlefront. So the story of the 11 began to fade, not erased, just unspoken, but Wereth remembered. The villagers told their children, who told theirs, passing the story like a quiet legacy. Every winter, older residents walked to the field where the bodies were found. Some laid flowers. Some prayed. Some simply stood in silence, remembering the night they opened their homes to strangers, and the price those men paid for wearing American uniforms. Years became decades. Snow fell, melted, fell again. In 1994, 50 years after the massacre, a Belgian named Herman Langer decided silence had lasted long enough. His parents had been among those who risked their lives to shelter American soldiers. He had grown up with the whispered stories. Now he wanted the world to hear them. He found military records. He tracked down veterans who remembered the 333rd. He dug through archives, letters, casualty lists. Slowly, painfully, he pieced together the truth. 11 names, 11 faces, one crime. Langer placed a handmade wooden cross in the field where the men died. It stood crooked in the wind, snow gathering at its base, but it drew attention. Tourists asked questions. Historians took notice. Belgian newspapers wrote small articles. Then American researchers arrived, shocked that such a massacre had gone unrecorded in history books. The Wereth 11 began to rise from the snow. In the United States, veterans of the 333rd and the segregated artillery units spoke up. Old men with weak voices and strong memories told stories of men who had fought like lions and died without recognition. They described firing their guns until their hands bled. They described marching through snow under artillery fire, listening to tanks grind through the forest behind them. They spoke of the 11 who vanished and the silence that followed. One veteran said, "They fought for a country that never fought for them." They were soldiers twice, once against Hitler, once against home. That truth cut deep. Slowly, painfully, respect grew. Articles emerged in military journals. Historians published essays. Television segments aired brief stories about the massacre. At last, the world began to look. And then something changed. In 2004, a permanent memorial was unveiled in Wereth, a black granite monument bearing the names of the 11 Americans murdered in that field. Soldiers, families, villagers, and veterans stood together in the farmland where snow had once hidden their bodies. The American flag waved beside the Belgian flag. For the first time, their sacrifice was honored publicly. Not in whispers. Their names echoed across the valley. A bugler played taps. Some of the villagers who had seen the men march into the night were now old, leaning on canes. They wept openly. They had lived with guilt for 50 years. Not because they betrayed the Americans, but because they couldn't save them. The monument gave them something they had never been allowed: closure. From that day, the Wereth 11 were no longer forgotten. Monuments alone do not write history, but they force it to speak. The U.S. Army updated its records. Museums and documentaries began telling the story. Students learned what happened that winter night. The 11 men who died in silence finally took their place among the honored dead. In 2022, the monument still stands, a dark stone against green grass and blue sky, a reminder that war remembers everything, even the things countries try to forget. The snow no longer hides their bodies. History no longer hides their names. And Wereth, the little village that offered warmth to strangers in the dead of winter, forever carries the memory of 11 American soldiers who marched into the dark with their hands raised, believing in honor, even when honor did not believe in them. Their story did not end in that field. It ended when silence finally broke. The files sat in dusty military cabinets for decades, thin folders stamped with cold black letters. KIA. Not murdered, not executed, not war crime. Just 3 letters that hid everything. The Army had collected testimony, reports from medics, photographs of the bodies in the snow, details of wounds, the location of bullet impacts, the fact that every man had been shot at close range with his hands tied. But as the war ended and Europe rebuilt, the case slid sideways, lost between bureaucracy, politics, and a world ready to forget. After 1945, the Allied War Crimes Commission hunted Nazis across Germany. SS officers were dragged into courts, generals were hanged, lawyers documented evidence by the ton. Thousands of trials took place, thousands of files were opened, and yet the Wereth case was pushed into silence. Investigators visited the site. They knew the unit responsible. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the elite shock troops personally sworn to the Führer. Their insignia, a skull grinning beneath black caps, told the world exactly what they were. The men who killed the 11 belonged to this division, marching west in a frenzy of vengeance, anger, and racial hatred. The Army had names of possible perpetrators. Villagers recognized faces. Belgian witnesses recalled accents, uniforms, and specific officers barking orders. The 1st SS Panzer Division did not hide its tracks. It never did. But as trials moved forward, priorities shifted. The Cold War arrived like a thunderclap. America needed West Germany as an ally, not a defeated nation full of public hangings. Files were quietly closed. Some SS officers traded information for freedom. Some blended back into German society, taking jobs as policemen, businessmen, even politicians. Justice slipped away, one signature at a time. Families of the 11 soldiers lived with grief the way the earth holds frost, silent, heavy, always there. Most never knew the truth. Some suspected, whispering that the Army wasn't telling everything. A few heard rumors carried home by veterans who had been there in Belgium. But official letters stayed cold as the winter that killed their sons. Killed in action, the telegram said. During combat operations. Nothing more. One mother kept her son's boots beside the front door for 10 years, refusing to believe he was gone. One widow remarried but never took off her husband's dog tags. She wore them beneath her blouse like armor. One brother fought in Korea, carrying rage like a secret weapon. For black families across America, loss was not new. Their sons fought in every war the country ever fought, and still came home to segregation signs and closed doors. The men of the 333rd had been soldiers, but they had also been symbols. They represented a nation that preached freedom while denying it to them. They wore a uniform that didn't protect them from prejudice, and even in death, justice treated them like shadows. But history is stubborn. Truth refuses to stay buried forever. By the 1980s, historians studying the Battle of the Bulge noticed something odd. Casualty reports from the 333rd didn't match their troop movements. 11 men unaccounted for, 11 listed as KIA with no battlefield notes. Military researchers started asking questions. Some veterans spoke, voices cracking, eyes clouded with memory. They described the morning after the massacre, the frozen bodies, the torn gloves, the silent field. As interest grew, so did anger. How could the United States Army, fighting a war against racism and tyranny, ignore the execution of its own black soldiers? Why did no one stand trial? Why did no one speak up? For a long time, answers were deflected or ignored. Lack of evidence. Could not identify responsible personnel. Insufficient witnesses. But historians pushed harder. They searched archives in Washington, Brussels, and Berlin. They interviewed survivors of the 1st SS Panzer Division, many now elderly men living quiet civilian lives. Most denied everything. Some claimed they remembered nothing. But a few talked, carefully. One former SS soldier admitted that orders had been clear. No mercy for artillery units, no mercy for black troops. Hitler's war was ideological, fueled by racial hatred, and the men of the 333rd represented everything the SS despised. American power, democracy, and equality they refused to believe in. Still, no legal case returned to court. Too many decades had passed. Too many witnesses gone. Too many files missing. Justice, when delayed that long, becomes a ghost. But something else happened. Something more powerful than trials. Remembrance. It began in Wereth, where villagers spoke proudly of the men they tried to save. Then it spread to universities, military academies, black veterans groups. Documentaries aired. Articles were written. School children learned the names. Staff Sergeant Thomas Fort, PFC. Mager Bradley, PFC. George Davis, PFC. Robert Green, PFC. Jim Leatherwood, PFC. Nathaniel Moss, PFC. James Stewart, PFC. Dew Turner, PFC. George W. Moten, PFC. Curtis Adams, Staff Sergeant Herbert G. Moreno. The world spoke their names aloud, and in doing so returned them to life. In time, Army historians corrected the records. KIA became what it should have been from the start. Killed by enemy forces while prisoners of war. Then, executed. Then, war crime. The layers of silence were peeled away, revealing truth beneath. Today, cadets at West Point study the massacre as part of military ethics training. The lesson is simple but painful. Honor means nothing if it is not given to all. The nation that sends men to fight must protect them, not only on the battlefield, but in memory. There is a plaque in the U.S. Army's official archives, black stone with gold lettering, bearing the names of the Wereth 11. Soldiers walk past it every day. Many stop. Many touch the stone. Some weep. The SS soldiers who killed the 11 never faced a courtroom, but their actions are recorded forever, condemned by history, by memory, by truth, and the men they murdered stand taller in death than their killers ever did in life. The world finally listened. The silence finally ended. The Belgian winter is quiet now. The forests around Wereth are peaceful, the rolling hills patched with green in spring, gold in summer, and bright white when the cold returns. Cows graze where tanks once passed. Children play where artillery once thundered. The farmhouse where the 11 sought shelter still stands. Old stones, worn shutters. a small path leading to the door where frightened men knocked in the dark all those years ago. Time did not erase the land. It simply softened its edges. But if you walk into the fields at dawn, when frost clings to the grass and the wind moves low across the earth, you can still feel something there, an echo, a memory pressed into the soil. Every year on January 23rd, Belgians gather at the monument. Some are descendants of the villagers who hid the Americans. Others are U.S. soldiers stationed in Europe. Some are tourists who came because they heard the story and felt compelled to stand where those men fell. They lay wreaths on the stone. They read the names aloud, letting each one hang in the cold air. No speeches full of pride, no grand ceremony, just remembrance, simple and pure. Because the Wereth 11 did not die for glory. They died for humanity. They were men who fought for a country that promised freedom. They were artillerymen who held their ground against tanks and infantry until the last round was fired. They were soldiers who walked into the dark with hope, believing that surrender meant survival. They were Americans, just like every man in uniform that winter, and yet their nation forgot them. But time has a strange way of reshaping memory. Truth returns like thawing ice, slowly revealing what was hidden beneath. And in Wereth, truth rose where snowfall once fell. Today, schoolchildren in Belgium know the story by heart. They learn about the Americans who came to liberate their villages, who shared chocolate with hungry families, who smiled for photos beside broken barns. They also learn about the 11 who died on their soil, and how their grandparents tried to save them. In history class, the Wereth 11 are no longer nameless. They are symbols of courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. Their photographs hang on classroom walls. Their names are spoken with respect. Across the ocean in the United States, the change came later. Museums added plaques. Military academies taught their story. Documentaries aired, showing faces once forgotten. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion received long overdue recognition for its role in the Battle of the Bulge. And on Veterans Day ceremonies around the country, their names are sometimes read aloud beside men who fought at Bastogne, Okinawa, and Normandy. It took decades, but their place in history is no longer silent. For the survivors of the 333rd, the recognition came late in life. Old men stood at the monument in Wereth, touching the carved letters as tears ran down wrinkled cheeks. They whispered the names of friends lost in the snow. One veteran, leaning on a cane, said softly, "They were my brothers. They died like soldiers." Another placed his faded artillery patch on the stone and saluted with a trembling hand. They had carried the memory all their lives, waiting for the world to finally listen. And what of the soldiers who committed the massacre? History names some of them. Their unit is known. Their commander is known. But war ended before justice could reach them. Some died on the Eastern Front. Some surrendered to Allied forces. Some rebuilt their lives in the years of German reconstruction. They took different paths into silence. But their crime did not disappear. Every time a visitor reads the plaque in Wereth, their guilt is written again. Justice in a courtroom may never have come, but justice in memory does not fade. If you visit the field at night, the monument stands alone under the stars. The wind moves slowly across the grass. The old wooden fence creaks. In that quiet, it is easy to imagine the sound of boots crunching snow, the low murmur of frightened voices, the crack of rifle fire echoing through the valley. The land remembers. It always will. The story of the Wereth 11 survived because ordinary people refused to let it die. Villagers who lived through terror. Historians who saw missing pages in the Book of War. Families who demanded to know the truth. Soldiers who carried the memory like a weight in their hearts. No single person preserved the story. Everyone did. War is full of heroes, but some are buried twice. Once in the earth, once in silence. The Wereth 11 were buried 3 times, in snow, in history, and in a nation that did not want to confront the truth of how it treated its black soldiers. But memory is stronger than silence. In the end, truth reached the surface. Today, when American soldiers visit Wereth, many leave their patches on the monument. Infantry, cavalry, armor, artillery, different units, different wars, same uniform. They stand and salute not just to the 11, but to every man who ever fought under a flag that did not give him equality. When they turn to leave, they walk past a plaque that reads, "In memory of the 11 African-American soldiers who gave their lives for freedom and democracy on Belgian soil. 23 January 1945. It is simple, it is true, it is enough. The last footprints of the Wereth 11 melted long ago, but their memory remains carved in stone, carried in stories, taught in classrooms honored by soldiers, and held in the quiet heart of a Belgian village that refused to forget them. They left their country to fight for justice overseas. It took half a century, but justice finally came home to them.